Here we are with our $15 extreme grind, and for today's session we're going to continue opening 100%, but this time we're also going to call 100% of our opponent's min raises and then look to check raise or donk bet at a very high frequency as well. Also, I'm going to try and mix up my bet sizing a little and do as much floating as possible so that we can really see a variety of post-flop scenarios while showcasing just how passive our opponents will generally be when forced to sustain aggression over multiple streets. So having said that, let's get started and see what we can find. So we start off with pocket threes, which we can open shove in a normal game, but for interest's sake, I'm in raise and take it to the flop after opponent flats. So in this spot, I'm c-betting any two cards as I begin to assess my opponent's game. When villain flats, I think his range is composed primarily of second or third pairs, with maybe some weaker ace-x hands, some queen-x or 9-8, 8-7 type draws. Now, of course, our opponent could also have some weaker king-x hands or be slow playing two pairs, but those make up a pretty small part of his range and generally show up as a check raise rather than a check call at these limits on such a wet board. Not to mention that if I was being as perceptive as I should be at the tables, I would have noticed that our villain snap called my c-bets both on the flop and the turn. And to me, that means he either has a draw or a weak pair that he wants to scare us into letting him get to a cheap showdown. And although a lot of people might say that we shouldn't be betting on this river since we have showdown value against all ace-x, queen-x, and 9-8, 8-7 type hands in his range, I personally think that because the timing tell is so valuable in this spot, and the fact that our opponent's our own perceived range looks so much stronger than his, I'm happy to bomb away here and try and get him to fold out nearly his entire value range, which at best is a weak king-x, but most likely just a jack-x or 10-x. As I've said before, and I'll definitely say again, even though we shouldn't make a habit of trying to get our opponents to fold a pair in a hypo turbo, in my experience, there's still going to be plenty of profitable situations for us to do exactly that. As for the bet sizing, once he made the snap check call on the flops and I signed him the range we discussed, I decided to make my turn bet a little bigger, both to charge his draws, which I didn't expect him to fold, and to make it seem as if I had a strong hand I was trying to protect / get full value from, so that if I decided to try to fold out his weaker pairs on the river, I'd hopefully get max credit for having a hand. I'd intended to bet actually, so I had just a couple of chips above a pot-sized bet left for a potential river shove, but unfortunately my basic math skills failed me and I was left with just under a pot-sized bet. But we go ahead and shove, and our opponent insta-snap folds, meaning we're most likely up against that weak draw part of his range. And before we move on, notice that shoving this river also provides us with pretty solid fold equity versus the few 4x's and 6x's in his range, queen 6 suited or ace 4 for example. Although we will get frustration calls from those some of the time, I think we generally will be folding them out at a much higher frequency than will be necessary to make the shove profitable. Next, we get dealt ace-9 suited in the big blind. Our opponent 4x's his first button, and although this is a spot we can happily fist pump shove, due to the rules of today's extreme grind, I just call and see the flop. So at this point I was thinking that its 4x raise pointed to a range of like ace-x, 2 Broadway cards, a couple of mid to weak pocket pairs, and some decent suited connectors like 6-7 or 9-10 suited. So we pick up a decent flop with a straight draw, backdoor flush draw, and ace high, and since I felt it was unlikely my opponent would check back with his chip stack, I decided to check to him, figuring it was a near certainty he would bet, and I could happily get it in versus range, being approximately a 55 to 45% favorite, according to Flopzilla, and assuming we ranged him accurately. So we check to our opponent, and he obliges by overshoving, and we call and manage to hold.